All right, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'd like to go ahead and talk about 1984, Book 2. So I've got my notes here. You can feel free to take notes if you like, or you can just read along with me. So for Book 2, we start out with the emerging love story. I bet you didn't see it going that direction, or maybe you did. And we have the interaction between Winston and the girl from the fiction department, who we later learn is named Julia. So Winston has this encounter with Julia in the hallway where her arm is in a sling and she's walking by him and she falls down. And he has this weird moment where he's conflicted inside and he feels like he should help her, but also he's very suspicious that she might be a member of the Thought Police and she might be out to get him somehow. And so we see the very basic way in which the party has sort of robbed people of their humanity from this interaction. But in Winston, the desire to help overcomes, which is good. And he makes an attempt to pick Julia up and see if she's okay. And in that process, she slips a note into his hand. Now, of course, in a society that is surveilled from every angle, Winston cannot open the note immediately. He would be found by the telescreen. He can't even take it into the bathroom because, as he says, you can be sure they're watching you there, right, of all places. And so he has to really be really sneaky about when he can deploy this note to see what it says. And he allows his imagination in this time to really run wild. And it further showcases just the level of isolation that each person is subjected to in this society. And he's, thinking, is this a message from the Thought Police? Is it a message from the Brotherhood? What could it possibly say? And we find out, of course, later he's able to slip it into a stack of paper at work and discovers that the note says, "I love you," which is something that didn't even occur to him. And so out of the blue, this becomes a love story. But the character at whom the advance is targeted is so disconnected that he doesn't even recognize that as a possibility. I think that's important to note. So he wants to initiate communication with Julia, but he's unable to do that because, like I said, it's surveilled. He can't really go to where she works in the fiction department because it's so far away from where he works, he wouldn't have an excuse for even being there. So he has to really time the meeting correctly, and he decides that he's going to do it in the canteen, or like the cafeteria. And he tries several times, and there's always somebody there that knows him or someone else. There's that one guy that calls him over to the seat, and he fantasizes about driving a pickaxe into the guy's face because he's so frustrated by all this. And it also shows the level at which he's indoctrinated with violent tendencies, as everyone in this society is. But eventually he does get to where he can have like a 15-second exchange with Julia. And they agree to meet in Victory Square, which is really bizarre because Victory Square has telescreens on every surface. It would be kind of like Times Square in New York City or something like that. There would be constant surveillance of everyone. But their logic is that safety in numbers, right? It's the same reason that birds move in flocks, because if you're in groupings, you have a higher chance of survival than you do if you're by yourself. So they decide to communicate in public in Victory Square. They have to be very careful about how they do it. They sort of stand beside each other and seem disinterested. And they agree basically to a further meet at a hideout that Julia has. And they get a few seconds where they can hold hands, which may or may not be smart, right? But so we have this developing, and we know that they're going to interact, but how are they going to be able to do it because they're so disconnected, right? And also in this part where we're in Victory Square, we see the Eurasian prisoner convoy. And I think on some level that's when the Eurasian prisoners are brought by on trucks and stuff, and they're described as having features consistent with someone from like Mongolia or something like that. And you can see kind of how the xenophobia or fear of the other, right, is emphasized by the party. The party uses the fear of the other to generate support for itself. to such an extent that it will parade the so-called enemy through the square so that everyone can see them and see the enemy. And strangely enough, it seems like they don't see their humanity. But Winston sort of does. He struggles, right? He's always struggling between the way that the party wants him to see things, or orthodoxy, and the way that he wants to see things. He wants to see the humanity in these people on some level and sort of relate to their suffering as prisoners of war. But at the same time, he's got this heavy indoctrination that this is the enemy, right? And this society is one where the execution of criminals, of prisoners and stuff like that, prisoners of war, is a public spectacle. They want the public to be involved in the violent processes and to be invested in them. And so we see that sort of come to life in this scene. Then we have the sort of the meeting in the county, I meant to say in the country, nature as a refuge. Now, Orwell does kind of portray nature as a place they can escape to and hide, but then he also subtly implies, or Winston implies anyway, that maybe even nature is surveilled. And I started thinking about trail cams, like for those of you that do outdoorsy stuff like hunting and things like that. There are these cameras that people will put on a tree and leave there to see what kind of wildlife comes through and stuff. And it just made me think of that. Like, yeah, that's kind of the world we're living in, right? You don't even know if the woods is private or not. So there is this retreat into nature that they have, and Winston is very nervous, and he tries to act normal by picking bluebells. And I think the bluebell flower is a really interesting sign or symbol in this text because it represents that aesthetic value, or that, like, beauty. Things in this world do not have beauty. The beautiful aesthetics and like art and things like that really don't exist in Orwell's world. The party sees it as a threat. They see it as a way for people to get joy out of life in a way that the party can't reach them. And so they really discourage the pursuit of anything beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. Everything is dull and drab and dingy and uniform. So when we see Winston gathering these bluebells, it's like he's trying to play it off, but really what he's doing is something that is unorthodox, right? It's something that he shouldn't do. He should just be like, oh yes, flowers, those have a function in nature, and just walk right by. But he can't help but noticing how pretty they are, and he can't help this innate appreciation for things that are beautiful. So yeah, I mentioned the woods have ears, right? Do they? Maybe they do. And so then we do have like the interaction between the two of them where they sort of acclimate to each other. And Winston is very, very nervous about his physical appearance. He's a lot older than Julia. He's very frail. I believe I mentioned before that Orwell had tuberculosis when he wrote this book. So the protagonist being sickly is sort of a logical conclusion, I think, to going through that process as a writer. And so he's not the most desirable guy, really, by the standards of like youth and health and stuff like that. So he doesn't really feel like her attraction is real, or he can't believe it, and she kind of has to get him out of that. And eventually they do have relations in this scene. And they talk about sex as an act of rebellion, which is interesting. Is sex an act of rebellion? Should it be an act of rebellion? And if it is, why? Rebellion is obviously a response to repression. So maybe the natural consequence of a repressive society is that there will be people who, in an act of rebellion, will indulge sexuality, maybe carelessly or something like that. I don't know. It's an interesting idea of like sex as a rebellious act. And we have the symbol of Julia tearing off the red sash that is a embodiment of her involvement in the the chastity group or something. Drawing a blank. But anyway, he saw that before in a dream, so that was a bit of foreshadowing. And it's kind of weird how Orwell uses dreams. That's something that I like. I've really been curious about that for a while, how Orwell uses dreams to deliver a message. And that's one of them. Like, he has this premonition that Julia will tear off her sash, which is a symbol of sexual repression, and then it happens. So very interesting stuff here about sex as an act of rebellion and all that stuff. And her promiscuity I mean, to use a sort of old-fashioned term, her promiscuity is what makes her attractive to Winston, because it shows that she's rebellious, that she can't be contained, that she is someone who can stand up to the party and defy them. And that to him is what is attractive, which is kind of flies in the face of traditional views about that stuff. And so I think that's interesting. What is Orwell trying to say? Who knows? There's probably multiple levels of meaning there. Okay, so I think that's the end of this note slide. Let's go on to the next one. So they do begin to maintain a relationship, but the question comes up, can they really keep it a secret? In a world where they're watching you from every angle, I'm not sure they can. And they're not sure they can. And so they constantly live with this fear that one day someone will kick in the doors and that will be it, right? That's it for them. No more honeymoon, you know. So that's constantly a looming fear. But they do get to know each other. And one of the things that Winston discovers is that Julia is not interested in systems and structures. Or how things work, or why they work the way they work. She doesn't ask these kinds of sort of, I don't know, intellectual might not be the right word, but they're questions that you would ask if you had a certain type of mind, a certain type of a way of viewing things, and you wanted to know, you know, you wanted to be able to see the forest for the trees, as they say, right, to use a cliche. So she's only interested in her own happiness. And I wonder, is this fair of Orwell? Like, what is he saying here? You know, why is that the right way to be concerned with your own happiness as opposed to systemic structures? Because an individual has very little, at least in my view, most individuals have very little effect on systems and structures. You know, you can participate, but you need like a very large consensus in order for the sort of actions of the individual to matter. They have to be done in mass, which is sort of a contradiction. So I wonder, is like, it kind of makes it seem like Julia's just doesn't have the mind for it, but really I wonder if she's actually more with it than Winston, because Winston is so worried about finding reasons for everything that he kind of overthinks himself into unhappiness, which is probably not good, right? So Julia has this theory about sexual repression, that it makes people easier to rope into violence and the worship of Big Brother. And the party deals with the sex instinct in a very interesting way. They try to suppress it, except in the most base and animalistic ways, like pornography and prostitution and things like that. They try to, they sort of very subliminally encourage that kind of stuff, or they allow it, or they don't punish it as severely as they do other things. But the sexual intercourse between party members, especially based on emotion or interest or attraction, is totally forbidden because they don't want individuals to build any intimacy. So the sex act isn't eradicated, it's just corrupted. And it's corrupted in this horrible way. And I wonder, like, you know, for your third essay, you're supposed to think about ways in which the novel might relate to society. How does our society deal with the sex instinct? Does it corrupt it? Does it alter it? Is sex an act of rebellion in our society? Does it depend on the context? It's an interesting idea. It's also fair to mention that another dystopian novel, also written by a British gentleman named Aldous Huxley, in his novel Brave New World, he sort of takes the opposite view. He thinks that instead of repressing the sex instinct and trying to make it corrupt and base, like the party does in 1984, he thinks that the powerful will try to overstimulate with the sex instinct and bombard you with sexuality. And it's kind of to think, because, you know, you look at a lot of the advertisements and things that go around today. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff, a lot of this like overstimulation. So which is it that gets sort of that manifests in reality? I'm not saying that our society is a dystopia, but I do like to make comparisons because I think it sparks an interesting conversation. Okay, we'll get away from that. They have the daydream about pushing Catherine off the cliff. Remember that Catherine is Winston's wife. They were together for a time for the purpose of procreation. All marriages in Orwell's system are, of course, arranged by the state, by the party, and they are very careful not to pair people that will actually like each other's company or that will have a physical attraction or some kind of chemistry. So this marriage that he was in was completely loveless, and it was strictly for the purpose of procreation. And even that didn't work, so they split up. But technically, Winston is still married to this woman, so he has some level of like resentment for that fact, because it means, in a legal sense, although there are no laws, it means that he's sort of taken, or that he can't be with Julia in the way that he wants to be. It's kind of a symbol of that, even if it doesn't mean that legally necessarily. So yeah, they have the daydream, like, yeah, I thought about pushing her off a cliff and I didn't. She's like, well, you probably should have, right? And it's a little bit like tongue-in-cheek, almost like gallows humor, but at the same time, it shows you like, man, these people are like, they really are programmed. Because even though they try to resist the party and they try to be themselves and be what the party isn't, they have been programmed with these violent tendencies from the time, for a very long time. I mean, Winston, of course, like, he was a child before the revolution, but he doesn't remember anything. But Julia is younger than him. She was born into this stuff. So the party has an influence on a level that they can't even detect as individuals, and it is this violence. Of course, later Winston realizes it and comments on it, but you start to see it here, right? Pushing a woman off a cliff because you don't like her, like that is a very evil thing to do and to think, but they just treat it as normal because that's how ensconced violence is in this society. And think about violence in our own society. There's a lot of it. So Mr. Charrington's shop, is this a safe escape? Are he and trying to create a little bubble for themselves? So think of the symbolism behind the coral paperweight. The paperweight that he acquires at the end of book 1, it's a beautiful little fragment of coral encased in glass. And it represents on some level the beautiful little life that Winston wants to have. It's also aesthetically pleasing, right? It's pretty. So it's already against what the party is, right? But he wants to have this little bubble where he can exist in his own world separate from everything else, and that's represented by the paperweight. And so he tries to actualize that eventually in Mr. Charrington's shop. He begins to see Mr. Charrington's shop as an escape for him, because mainly it does not have a telescreen, and so he sees it as like a place of safety, even though returning to the same place over and over again is really stupid because they follow you around. But he still allows himself to hope. We can sort of see Winston making his own bed here. Like, we feel sorry for the guy, but he's in love. He's not thinking clearly, right? So Julia steals like the sugar, coffee, tea, and makeup, the stolen luxuries from the inner party, which is a really bold move. But we see like there's some commentary here on class. The party and the proles are terribly poor. But the party is terribly poor and completely unfree. The proles are free, but they don't do much with their freedom, and so they're not a threat to the system. Now, the inner party gets these luxuries, and that's why they do things. So it's a commentary on some level on class and like why class stratifications form and why people basically sell each other out. As the inner party has, right? They get the goods and no one else does. And we see that. We also see when Julia puts on makeup and she's like allowed to sexualize herself or to sort of beautify herself, maybe sexualize isn't the right term, that he's very attracted to that, and he sees sort of this, he sees a glimpse of this other world that could exist and that should exist but doesn't, right? Through makeup, or as they call it, what is it, paint? Do they say paint? Scent and paint and things like that. I think they use different words. Also in the Charrington's apartment, we see the rat, and so we get information about Winston's greatest fear. His greatest fear is rats. And why might that matter? I don't know. What does a rat represent, right? If someone rats you out, what does that mean? Is that a symbol that we should factor in? There are also bugs in this room. That's kind of weird. So this emphasis on his greatest fear. If someone knows your greatest fear, is that good for you or bad? Just planting the seed, folks. Planting the seed. We're going to move right along on to page 3. So we've also the paperweight represents his own life, but also the paperweight and several other fragments of history are provided in this chapter as links to the past. So the paperweight is a link to the past to show him, hey, Once upon a time, the world wasn't this way. It was different. And you don't know exactly how it was, but you can sort of use the pieces to put together a picture of something that might actually be preferable to the world that you're living in. But how do you know that that really exists, right? Because the party controls history. And Orwell emphasizes the control of history as a tool by which the powerful maintain their dominance. If you can control the historical narrative, you can do a lot of stuff. So these fragments of history, they run counter to the narrative that the party is portraying, but they're not enough to let Winston know how it really was. He's always left with these questions. The rhyme about St. Clement's Church is part of that as well. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 3 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, cried the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. That's the whole thing. And he eventually he pieces together this rhyme, getting different pieces. He gets a piece from Charrington. He gets a piece later from O'Brien. And so he's putting together this picture of the past. And that's kind of, that rhyme is like a symbol of that process of him trying to put together a picture of how it really is versus how the party says it is. So we also, unfortunately, we all saw this coming. Winston saw it coming. Syme is vaporized. Poor Syme. Let's have a moment of silence for Syme. Don't stay silent too long because he was kind of a jerk. But if you're smart enough to become a threat, it doesn't matter how orthodox you are. That is the lesson from Syme. Syme was very smart, and he was almost too smart for his own good. And he tried to be really orthodox so that the party would tolerate his intelligence, but eventually it didn't work. And since he wasn't, I guess he wasn't good enough or wasn't invited to be initiated into the inner party, he's vaporized, disappears, and he becomes an unperson. There's this concept in Orwell's world of an unperson, a person that just gets erased. They don't exist anymore. Bye-bye. So we can't even talk about Syme, and to do so would be a symbol of thought crime. And later we know that O'Brien uses this as a way to get Winston to trust him. He references Syme in an offhanded way, and Winston's like, that's thought crime. Is O'Brien a conspirator? And it allows him to trust him. Parsons and Hate Week and the Hate Song and his awful children. Parsons is orthodox and stupid, right? Which means that Winston believes that Parsons will never be vaporized. So it seems like Orwell thinks that your worth or whatever to the society is somehow based on intelligence. And I wonder if this is right. I sometimes wonder if Orwell wasn't a bit of an elitist, especially when it came to intelligence and being intelligent or having intelligence. It seems like he valued these attributes and thought that some people just didn't have them, and so those people were sort of not a threat to the status quo because they could not even understand how the status quo worked if they wanted to. Parsons is one of those people. So it's kind of a weird sort of commentary, right? Is he right about that? I don't know, maybe not. Winston's mad fantasies of happily ever after, he keeps allowing himself, like, what if I could get divorced with Catherine? What if I could disguise myself as a prole and run away with Julia? It's all dreams, right? It's not going to serve him. And he has this fixation on O'Brien. Is the Brotherhood real? Has it truly infiltrated the highest ranks of the inner party? Is O'Brien, is he the one that's going to lead us out of this sort of nightmare? And O'Brien has that instance where he talks to Winston to gain his trust. And so it's like, is O'Brien, what side is he on? Julia believes that Goldstein is an invention of the party, which is an interesting idea. And they have that exchange where they say, you know, he says that you're only a rebel from the waist down, which she loves him for it, which is bizarre. But saying that means that she's only concerned with her own sexual freedom and she doesn't actually care about the way things run and how they are. But here she has this insight about Goldstein's, like, is she right about that? Later we find out she is, right? She might be. Winston has these dreams of his mother. Again, Orwell using dreams as a way to sort of build character. Winston's dreams about his mother and his sister show him, I think it's a commentary on some level about human nature, or like the self-serving nature of humanity, because he's a child during this time. So he isn't really developed in an ethical sense or anything like that. But he still has this innate drive to, like, feed himself and to look out for himself and to worry about himself. And so he ends up, like, kind of starving his mother and sister But can we fault him for this? I mean, he's a child. He's responding to survival drives that are deeply rooted in his psyche. And so I wonder if Orwell's not using these dream sequences as a way to make a commentary on human nature. And it's like, you know, we keep looking to build a utopia or a better society, but what if we're confined by biology? What if our nature is what we are and how we prioritize ourselves, sometimes to the detriment of others? What if that prevents us on a fundamental level from attaining that kind of stuff? I'm not saying that's true, but it's something that I think is toyed with here in this exchange, because if a child can starve its own sister because of its own self-interest, then what help does humanity have, really? You know, so that's sort of a heavy but a valuable question, I think. So Winston believes that the proles are still human, and that Julia and Winston have lost their humanity through their involvement in the party. And we see this with the violence and stuff. And he talks about how I kicked a human hand into a gutter like it was a cabbage stalk, is what he says. And it's like, I'm not even human, but the proles are, right? And there's that emphasis on the woman that keeps singing outside of Charrington's apartment. And so Winston really does believe that the proles will save the future, that there will be some kind of conscious awakening on behalf of the majority of people that will make them very difficult to control in this way. And it's a great idea, but is it true, right? This is we have it also sort of juxtaposed along with this sort of elitist view about people being measured by their intelligence. And, you know, most people, how many people do you know that really concern themselves with structural problems and issues? There are lots of people out there that do, but I think the majority of people do kind of have this sort of self-involvement to the point where they don't have time for that stuff. They got their own things to worry about, their own stuff they're caught up in. And so how can a conscious awakening even really happen? But he allows himself to believe, right, to hope. Winston and Julia begin to accept their fate. They sort of come to terms with the fact that, yeah, eventually we're going to get caught. There's no way. We're being way too reckless. They know that they'll be tortured, and they talk about it, and they talk about confessing and how they'll be made to confess and all this stuff. But they make the agreement that they're not going to betray one another. No matter what we do, we will not betray each other. And so that's the idea. It's like there's this one little inch inside your mind where you can hold out and they can't get you. But that's the question. Can they get you in your own mind? Can you really hold out if you're being tortured or subjected to, as it is said today, enhanced interrogation techniques? Hard to say, right? Maybe they can hold out, but that's not really, they see that as a victory. Is that a victory? Just because you don't sell out each other, right? Are you really winning in that sense? Like, no one's going to remember your name, so what does it even matter, right? This is tough. But they vow never to betray one another. So they go to O'Brien's apartment, and we have the confession. Yeah, I think there are a number of things about this that are a little bit suspicious, but I'll leave it up to you as to whether or not you trust O'Brien. First of all, the confession they make is really terrible. Like, they say they'll throw acid in a child's face. It's like, why would you say that? You're not actually better than your sort of the ones you hate if you're going to do things like that. So that's weird that the Brotherhood, like, is the Brotherhood even worth your time? And the Brotherhood's not going to save you. They're going to send you a razor blade if you get caught. And he talks about Emmanuel Goldstein and sort of the goals of the Brotherhood and how it's kind of hopeless, but right now we're just spreading the ideas, so you have to sacrifice yourself and not expect us to do you. And he can turn off the telescreen, which is weird, right? Wouldn't they just go, hey, why did he turn it off, right, if he was under suspicion? And do we really believe that the Brotherhood has infiltrated the highest ranks of the inner party, people who are allowed to have all this luxury and these things? Like, he's drinking wine out of a decanter, which Winston doesn't even really like, but he's never even seen it before, right? It's a luxury item that, you know, he just doesn't have any relation to. So why is O'Brien rebelling? Why would he give up all of that stuff for some ideal? Would he? I don't know. And his servant is weird too, right? Because he looks Eurasian. So that implies that, aren't they the enemy? Like, why does he have a servant that's of the enemy? Is this it's not really answered, right? And Winston wonders if this guy might have had like facial reconstruction or something. So we make an agreement that we're gonna get Goldstein's book, and Winston's like, yes, the Brotherhood is real, right? I'm gonna learn all these secrets and become part of the resistance. And so the plan is that one day during Hate Week, or just in the future, someone will walk by and go, hey, you dropped your briefcase, and Winston will pick up a briefcase, and inside will be Goldstein's book, and he will read it and then become part of the Brotherhood. So he has to wait till the perfect moment, right, when somebody comes and gives it to him. Another curious thing, and I mentioned this earlier, but O'Brien knows the end of the oranges and lemons rhyme. Mr. Charrington knew a piece, O'Brien knew a piece, and Winston knew a piece. So they're putting together this history. That's kind of weird. I don't know what you make of that. And I don't know what you make of this either. This is a really cryptic thing to say. Again, something that Winston dreamed prior. He says, we will meet in the place where there is no darkness. And O'Brien acts like he knows what he's talking about. And he's like, yeah, we'll meet in the place where there is no darkness, which who knows what that is, right? But how does he know that? Does he really know that? Or is he just going on with the joke? Is he like, yeah, okay, dude. Yeah, the place where there is no darkness. Are you okay? Right? No, I think he acts like he knows, which is weird. Can he read Winston's mind? Is he controlling Winston's mind somehow? We don't know, right? Very strange. So we have Hate Week, which is kind of like the 2 minutes hate, but for a week. It's like their big holiday where they just rouse up all this nationalist fervor and they all get really, really upset about everything. And right mid-sentence, the guy's giving a speech. Right mid-sentence, the enemy changes, and they put a bulletin in his hand that notifies him of this, and then without skipping a breath, he switches. It's no longer Eurasia, it's now East Asia that is the enemy. Oh, okay. So this transition just happened and everyone accepts it. So this is doublethink, right? You don't reconcile contradiction. You just accept whatever the orthodox power says is true, right? Does this happen in the real world? You tell me. Maybe not necessarily with Hate Week and all that stuff, but I think accepting orthodoxy just based on what they say is something that a lot of people do because they don't know what to think. So they'll let other people do the thinking for them. And they just, without thinking, they just transition. Oh, and then they look around. Oh, the agents of Goldstein have been at work, and they're going to run around and try to put it all back together. So weird moment, right? Shows you the level at which these people are controlled. All right. So he gets the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, which is a really, really boring part of the novel. And I imagine probably some of you fell asleep, right? Julia falls asleep, which I think is Orwell acknowledging, like, yeah, I get it. This is heavy. Just bear with me. But in this book, he sort of outlines the way that the system works. There are 3 major nations or powers that go by different names, but they have the same system of governance, basically, which is oligarchical collectivism. An oligarchy is ruled by the rich, right? So basically, everywhere is like a hierarchy where the rich rule and everyone else is subjugated. And even though they have differences in like symbols and names and stuff, the system is really the same. And there's this commentary that Orwell keeps suggesting that every time we have a revolution or we try to change the way things are, we always end up having the same stratum assert itself over and over again. Some people on the bottom, people in the middle, more or less, and then a few people on the top that have all the power and all the wealth and all that stuff. And it happens over and over and over again. And each time there are all these people that are like, it's going to be different. And then it never is. So is that right? I don't know. Maybe it could be different. What would have to change, though? That's the question. And I think Orwell implies that what would have to change would be a conscious awakening on behalf of most people. But as I said, is that even possible? So we know that the enemies just switch, and there's always this triangle of endless war. Whenever 2 are allied, they're at war with whichever one you're allied with, you're at war with the other, and each country is in that sort of a triangle. So it's just endless war, and war is not made to win. War is made to ensure scarcity, which is an interesting idea, because does the government want to ensure scarcity? Does scarcity actually help you subdue people, or does it just make people angry because they don't have enough, and so they're always discontent and they're always looking to overthrow you? This is something that Orwell posits. He's like, they want you wanting so that you're dependent on them. Maybe. But maybe you could go the route that Huxley goes. Maybe they want you to have more than you need so that you don't care, right? There's that old, I think it was a Roman saying, give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt, right? Bread being just food and circuses being entertainment. If you have your basic needs met and you are entertained, what reason is there for you to revolt? So it's an interesting idea. I don't know if Orwell was right about that. If you want to take the route in your essay that Orwell was wrong, that might be a way to do it, because I don't know that wars are fought to ensure scarcity. Maybe. Be curious to see what you think. The book asserts that the same hierarchy continually asserts itself. So if this is true, are we doomed to suffer tyranny, or how could it be avoided? I sort of already said that, but it's something worth repeating. He also says that control of history is essential to the party's dominance. So you always hear that statement, history is written by the victors. And you think about, like, whoever writes the history books, like, that's the person that people listen to, right? So I wonder, is that true, right? Does control of history or control of the narrative, does that really give you the power? I think we mentioned a few instances when we talked about the lottery about historical narratives that weren't really the way we thought they were. One of them that I mentioned then, if you recall, was the story of Thanksgiving, which, if you remember when you were in kindergarten, oh yeah, the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims to grow corn and then they had a big feast. Well, yeah, not exactly. Right, and then there was King Philip's War and basically a genocide, and so, you know, that is an instance where it seems as though we have polished that story for our own benefit. And if that happens in that one instance, we can prove. How often does it happen all over the world, right? How many times has history been recorded in a way that is one-sided? And we don't remember how many people lived in the past. We don't even remember their perspective because they're gone and they weren't around to make their case, right? Because they lost. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I know I keep saying that, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in this book if you think about it. Don't think about it too much, because then you'll get insomnia like me, and that's not good. And you won't be any fun at parties, which eventually you'll get used to, but it takes a while. Sanity is not statistical. What does he mean by that? What does Winston mean by that? Statistical, I guess, does he mean sanity is not defined by the masses? Like, what everyone believes isn't necessarily sane? Because that's kind of how we view sanity, right? Sanity is what conforms and insanity is what goes against. But maybe that's not the case, and maybe that's what he's suggesting. I don't know. It's kind of a vague statement. The red woman singing outside, Winston finds her beautiful. He daydreams about the Pearl Revolution. You know, Julia's like, that woman's big as a house. He's like, no, she's beautiful. Look at all the children she's had, and she's the spirit of humanity, and she's still human. And one day they'll rise up and they'll overthrow, right? So good on him for hoping. And then these are the last few notes we have for this. Both Winston and Julia say, we are the dead, which is then echoed by the telescreen behind the image of the church, and lo and behold, the thought police have busted us. It was Mr. Charrington all along. Did you see it coming? Did you think the room was bugged? There were signs, right? There were bugs in the room. There was a rat in the room. You know, oh, no telescreen. Mr. Charrington had all this knowledge about the past. He seemed like he wasn't really a prole if you actually looked at it. He was the only one that Winston could get real answers out of. So yeah, he's the thought police. Who knew, right? Maybe you did. I hope you did. The paperweight shatters. His own life is destroyed. His future is destroyed. All of his hopes and dreams are laying there battered on the floor. And they are, of course, beating him and stuff. It's very brutal. And we're left wondering at the end of book 2, is this it for Winston? Is he done? What happens to him now? Where are they going to take him? Is the Brotherhood real? Are they going to save him? Are they going to send the razor blade? I did tell you it wasn't a happy ending. So buckle up. So that's sort of the summary of book 2, right? And sort of some things to think about, to leave you thinking about. And the final thing, I hope that there's enough time left in class. As a final thing, where is it? 1 second. So some of you are thinking about the essay. I hope all of you are. Some of you maybe more than others. But I just wanted to give you some concepts. I know I mentioned a lot of this stuff before. It's going to seem like repetitive, but when you're writing this essay, you basically need to pick, was he right, yes or no? Or was he close? Like, was his vision valuable or was it just crazy, right? Essentially, I'm asking you to pick sides. Was he right? Was he wrong? Was he accurate? Was he inaccurate? He doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, but he can be like, he can predict trends. You can extrapolate trends from his writing and then apply them to the real world and say that he was right. It doesn't have to be an exact match. But I do want you to pick right or wrong. I don't want you to say he was right, wrong, right? Because that makes you look sort of indecisive. So the first one, domestic surveillance. We are surveilled by companies, by governments, foreign and domestic, and by ourselves, right? We surveil each other on social media. Our parents surveil the kids. We track each other on Snapchat. And everyone always says they turn that off, but some people don't. So that's something to think about, right? How prevalent is that? Every time you go to a store, how many times are you on camera a day? You come into the school building, you're on camera, right? You're being surveilled all the time, every action. So think about that. Fake news or propaganda or like making up stories, right? Comrade Ogilvy, right? Winston just creates this guy out of nowhere. Think about the news media and what's the difference between news and propaganda, and how do you tell the difference? And is our society overrun with propaganda? Are we creating a ministry of truth in a way? Are we sort of going down the wrong road in terms of the information that people have access to? And if we are, then how could we fix it, right? These are questions that Orwell's work makes us ask, because Winston is himself, he's like a propagandist. He makes stuff up on behalf of the party. So there are these people out there just churning out fake news, right? Just being Winston in the modern time. Censorship and the lack of free speech, which as we apply in the American context, that really only applies to the social media companies, which are not technically beholden to the First Amendment, but the social conversation, should they be, is one that is happening right now. And so maybe that's something you want to talk about. But it's not just the social media. It's also the federal government has used the Espionage Act to prosecute leakers, specifically people who leaked information, not to foreign powers or to enemies or anything like that, but to the public, right? You think about Watergate, you think about the revelations of Woodward and Bernstein. They had a leak, they had information from an anonymous source within the government that ended up implicating the President of the United States in a dubious scandal, and it caused him to resign. Now, what is the difference between what Woodward and Bernstein did back then and what's going on now? If you think about it, not a lot, but after 9/11, people got a lot more bold about using this archaic law called the Espionage Act, which if you want to look into this, you should look up the law. And it basically says that if you leak any kind of government secret, you can be prosecuted and you can be found guilty and you can be put to death. And there's no way for you to offer a public good defense. You can't say, well, yeah, I leaked these secrets, but I did it so that people would know what their government's doing. That's not a legitimate excuse. There's also the WikiLeaks problem. Now, I know some of you have very sort of fixated political opinions. WikiLeaks is an organization that has been able to leak a lot of information from anonymous sources about governments, about companies. They've been able to release more compromising private information about things like that than any other news organization in the world, which is pretty incredible. Now, there are people within our government and within foreign governments and stuff that say that WikiLeaks is like a hostile actor and they're getting this stuff from, like, they're basically playing the middleman between states, and you got like Russia giving them stuff and so that they can leak it on the United States and all this stuff. And maybe that's possible, but if you look into WikiLeaks, they don't actually know. A lot of times they don't know who their sources are. They intentionally try to protect the identity of their sources. So if you don't know who your source is, does that mean you shouldn't leak the information? In that case, Woodward and Bernstein should be in jail because they didn't know who he was. That guy had a code name. So yeah, what's going on with this, right? If someone came to you and say, I have public information that the government is doing something horrible and corrupt, but you know that if you tell that to the people, that they will prosecute you under the Espionage Act, what kind of message does that send to journalists? Maybe you don't think WikiLeaks is a journalistic institution, which is something you can think if you like. I'm not really going to weigh in. I know that there's a lot of controversy about that organization because of their involvement in political cycles, and people tend to be very tribalistic in their thinking, and they like them one minute and then they don't like them the next because they help or hurt whoever they're already invested in. But the premise of whether or not you should be able to leak information from anonymous sources for the public good is a very, very important discussion, and it's one that WikiLeaks is at the center of. So you might want to look into that if you are interested in that sort of thing. The violent media, does it affect the human mind? There's the big discussion of, you could do a paper about like video games, violent video games, and George Orwell's take that violent media makes you violent. Does it? This is a big discussion people have been having for a while. Does Call of Duty make people into criminals? Does Halo cause you to want to use violence on other people? I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what you could say there, right? Technology and the breakdown of communication. We never communicate anymore. We just stare at our phones. So what's that about? You know, is this something that we can overcome? And how is that like Orwell's world, where there are no interpersonal relationships really? You know, and we're kind of, not saying we're getting to that point, but people are less intimate, I think, than they used to be for a lot of different reasons. Technology is probably at the center of that. So this is kind of a sort of an out there topic, but like mind control or social programming, we see that Winston and Julia have stuff that the party has put in their head that they're not even aware of. So is that a real thing? Like, is brainwashing something that happens? And if so, how? Try to be careful. I don't need any rabbit holes. I don't need any talk about lizard people or anything like that. Got to bring the lizard people up. Stay consistent. The algorithmic manipulation of what we see. This is not, Orwell couldn't predict algorithms, but like the control that companies have and that social media has over what we see. No two people see the same internet. So what does that do in terms of like shaping people's opinions and confirming their biases and stuff like that? That's kind of dystopian. It's kind of Orwellian in an abstract sense. Or maybe you can use that as a way to say, hey, he didn't have a vivid enough imagination. It's worse than he thought, right? Which I'm not saying we live in a total dystopia, but you know, there are some dystopian things going on. So corruption or repression of the sex instinct, we mentioned that in the discussion, but yeah, you could write about that if you wanted to. Was he right about that or wrong? Endless warfare. I can't really remember a time in my life when the United States was not at war with some foreign entity or another. So does endless warfare exist? If so, what is the purpose? Probably not for scarcity, but maybe. Victory gin and victory cigarettes. Think about, like, are drugs helpful in subduing the population? Like, the gin kind of just makes Winston not care that his life is miserable. Is that the way that it works in our society? Do we let, because alcohol, if you think about it, you can't really make the public safety defense for alcohol. It's one of the most, if not the most dangerous drug there is. It's up there. And people die, people get abused, people do things they regret, all sorts of things, horrible things happen with alcohol. So the social safety argument isn't really there. Like, you can't really make much of a case for it. So why is alcohol legal and some drugs are not? Some drugs that are arguably less harmful. Do drugs play a role, as Orwell seems to suggest, in subduing populations, or like placating them, or giving them something to distract them or to ease their pain in a way that doesn't threaten the party, really? That's an interesting idea. We have gin, cigarettes, beer, and wine are the substances, and coffee that Orwell really gets into. And I think I've mentioned to you before, like, coffee underwent a change. When it first came into the Western world, it was taboo, and like, if you drank coffee, you were a weirdo. But then over time, because people found it was valuable in terms of increasing productivity at work, it became something that now we give it to kids. So it's like, or caffeine, not necessarily coffee. So that's an interesting, if you want to take that route, just throwing that out there. It's an interesting idea, which, you know, you could probably tally up the number of times I've said that in this video, and it would be interesting to see. But, you know, social class. How about his view of social class? Was he accurate? Was he an elitist about intellectualism and stuff? Are the proles capable of coming to consciousness? Are they capable of a revolution? Is the internet causing some kind of conscious revolution? Maybe you believe in that. There's the Arab Spring and all that stuff that happened, that showed that internet sort of could be used as a catalyst for transformation, but how effective is it really? Does it do more harm than good? That kind of thing. There's a lot of stuff in there about social class and revolution and sort of a conscious awakening on behalf of the many. Always a beautiful idea, but still waiting for it to happen. And then the party suppression of art. Does our society suppress art? Are there some forms of art that are more acceptable than others? Do we limit art in some way? What is art? These are questions that you could sort of toy with. Nothing beautiful is created in Orwell's world. Um, do we put limitations on beauty, or do we put limitations on what is defined as beautiful, or whatever? If you want to go that route with it, you can. These are just some ideas I want to give you. Remember, in the essay, you were putting forth an argument about whether or not Orwell was right or not. You're not summarizing the text. Don't just summarize what happens in the book. Tell me, was his vision accurate? Was it inaccurate? If so, why or why not? You're going to use secondary sources that pass the CRAP test that you find online, and I'll comment on this in the future. That's about all I have for you today, folks. I hope you're all doing well. You can email me if you have any questions, and have a great week.